This is not controversial among the American public. Overwhelming majorities of Democrats, independents, Republicans want to ban stock trading by members of Congress. And we've made a lot of progress in the Senate in the last couple years building a bipartisan coalition to ban it. In fact, legislation that Senator Merkley and I have worked on with bipartisan colleagues in the Homeland Security Committee passed out of that committee for the first time with bipartisan support to ban stock trading by members of Congress. That bill still hasn't been brought to the floor, and we all know that there are private conversations with members going to folks in leadership saying they don't want it to come to the floor.
You just heard that Senator ripped the curtain back and exposed the festering wound at the very heart of American democracy, the grotesque reality that members of Congress are sabotaging legislation that would prevent them from treating the United States Senate like their own personal casino. And you need to understand something absolutely critical right now, because this moment represents far more than just another political scandal or another minor violation of public trust. This is the culminating evidence of a systemic corruption so profound and so deeply entrenched in the architecture of American governance that it makes an absolute mockery of every principle upon which this republic was supposedly founded. And what you just witnessed is a sitting United States Senator having the courage to name the unnameable and speak the unspeakable truth that colleagues in his own chamber are actively conspiring behind closed doors with leadership to kill legislation that has overwhelming bipartisan public support, legislation that passed through committee with bipartisan votes. And you want to know what makes this revelation so absolutely explosive and so fundamentally important to grasp? It's that this is the first time a congressional stock trading ban has ever passed a U.S. Senate committee, representing years of advocacy and organizing and public pressure, finally breaking through one institutional barrier, only to be strangled in the crib by the very people who stand to lose their ability to profit from inside information. Think about the sheer audacity of what's happening here. Because when Senator Ossoff says that senators are having private conversations with leadership to prevent this bill from getting a floor vote, despite the fact that 86% of Americans support banning stock trading by members of Congress, including 88% of Democrats, 87% of Republicans, and 81% of independents, he's describing nothing less than a conspiracy against the American people, a coordinated effort by those who hold the public trust to undermine the public will in service of their own financial interests. And this isn't hyperbole or progressive exaggeration. This is the documented reality of how power operates when left unchecked. And this is precisely the kind of institutional corruption that breeds the cynicism and democratic decay that threatens the entire project of self-governance. Because when citizens watch their representatives openly defy overwhelming public consensus to protect their own ability to engage in what any reasonable person would recognize as legalized insider trading, what conclusion are they supposed to draw except that the system is fundamentally rigged and that their voices mean absolutely nothing compared to the portfolio returns of the political class? Now, before we go any further, let me tell you what's coming next, because we're about to expose exactly how lucrative this grift has become. We're going to name names and show you the specific trades that have made certain members of Congress wealthier than the most successful hedge fund managers on Wall Street. And we're going to connect this corruption to the broader crisis of legitimacy facing American institutions. But first, you need to understand the historical context, because Congress passed the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge (STOCK) Act in 2012, following more than 10 years of allegations that members of Congress were insider trading, legislation that was supposed to solve this problem by requiring disclosure and subjecting lawmakers to insider trading laws. But here's the absolutely infuriating part. The penalty for a member of Congress violating the STOCK Act is $200, a hardly impactful deterrence from the potential millions to be made off the stock market. And this reveals the fundamental farce at the heart of so much regulatory reform in America, where the appearance of accountability is manufactured through symbolic legislation, while the underlying mechanisms of exploitation remain perfectly intact, and even strengthened through the legitimization that comes with having supposedly addressed the problem. The intellectual dishonesty required to maintain this system is staggering, because no member of Congress has ever been prosecuted for insider trading under the STOCK Act, despite the fact that 54 members of Congress, executive officials, and numerous staffers have been shown to violate disclosure requirements. And this creates a situation where transparency itself becomes weaponized against reform, because lawmakers can point to their disclosed trades as evidence of compliance, while the disclosed information simply documents behavior that would land any ordinary citizen in federal prison if they possessed the same access to material non-public information that shapes markets and determines the fate of entire industries. And you want to know the really perverse part? There's a cottage industry of investors who monitor former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's disclosed stock trades, match her every move, and usually make a profit along the way, with a Nancy Pelosi stock tracker account on X amassing 1.2 million followers, which should tell you everything you need to know about how the public perceives the integrity of congressional trading, because when your disclosed trades become so reliably profitable that financial products are created to mimic them, when ETF funds whose ticker symbols are NANC and GOP invest in stocks that are bought or sold by Democratic and Republican members of Congress respectively, PKOE, you have moved well beyond the realm of coincidence or financial acumen, and into the territory of systemic corruption that everyone can see but that the institutions refuse to address. And this brings us to the absolutely critical revelation that Senator Ossoff delivered in that clip, which is that the legislation isn't being defeated through legitimate democratic processes or open debate on the merits. It's being killed through backroom deal-making and leadership manipulation, and the refusal to allow a floor vote precisely because leadership knows that if this came to a vote, it would pass overwhelmingly, since 76% of voters across the political spectrum believe members of Congress and their spouses should not be allowed to trade stocks while in office, including nearly 78% of Republicans and 80% of independents. And this procedural sabotage represents one of the most insidious forms of minority rule, because it allows a small number of people who control the levers of legislative process to block the expressed will of the American people without ever having to publicly defend their position or go on record opposing popular reform. And this is how oligarchy functions in a nominally democratic system, through the manipulation of institutional choke points and the gatekeeping power of leadership positions that can simply refuse to bring legislation to a vote, regardless of committee passage or public support. Now let me show you just how corrupt this has become, because the evidence is overwhelming, and the specific examples read like a parody of what insider trading would look like if you were writing a screenplay about congressional corruption, and nobody would believe it, because it would seem too heavy-handed, but this is the actual documented reality we're living in. So consider that on April 8, 2025, during a dip in the stock market after President Donald Trump had announced sweeping tariffs, Republican Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene bought thousands of dollars worth of stocks. Many of those stocks soared in value after the president paused most tariffs the following day, and at least 25 members from both parties made trades between Trump's tariff announcement and the subsequent pause. And if you think that's just savvy investing rather than the exploitation of advanced knowledge about policy decisions that would move markets, then I have a bridge to sell you, because this is exactly the kind of behavior that destroys public faith in democratic institutions when citizens watch their representatives profit from market volatility that those same representatives have the power to create or mitigate through their policy decisions. But wait, because it gets so much worse, and this is where we need to talk about Nancy Pelosi, because she has become the symbol of congressional stock trading corruption, not because she's uniquely corrupt compared to her colleagues, but because her trades have been so consistently and spectacularly profitable that they've attracted massive public attention and spawned an entire ecosystem of traders trying to replicate her returns. And the numbers are absolutely staggering, because since mid-2014, her strategy has yielded 858.58% in gains, whereas the S&P 500 only returned 263.2%, representing a 595% outperformance over the S&P 500. And when you consider that Pelosi is one of the wealthiest members of Congress, and in the last 3 years her disclosed trades had a volume of about $59 million, you begin to understand the scale of wealth accumulation we're talking about. Wealth that has been built while making policy decisions that affect the very companies and industries she's investing in. And this creates an absolutely untenable conflict of interest that corrodes the legitimacy of every legislative decision touching technology or healthcare or defense or any other sector where congressional oversight intersects with investment opportunity. The specific trades are even more damning when you examine them, because Pelosi disclosed her purchase of options on Tempus AI on January 17, 2025, and within a month Tempus stock skyrocketed from 35.115 to 89.44, and within 2022, Paul Pelosi purchased more than $1 million in shares of semiconductor company NVIDIA prior to Congress voting on a subsidy to the industry, with the purchase revealed in a disclosure filing from Nancy Pelosi's office, which represents exactly the kind of trading pattern that demonstrates how access to legislative information creates opportunities for profit that are simply unavailable to ordinary investors and defenders will say that these are Paul Pelosi's trades, not Nancy's, that he's a sophisticated investor with his own track record. But that distinction becomes meaningless when you understand that Pelosi effect describes how her disclosures spark waves of retail interest and trading activity. Financial platforms have launched Pelosi tracker portfolios and ETFs which automatically mirror her trades, and some of these products have even outperformed the S&P 500 because the market itself has concluded that following congressional trades provides an edge that can only be explained by access to information that isn't available to the general public. And here's what makes this moment so absolutely critical, and why the obstruction that Senator Ossoff is describing represents such a profound betrayal, because we actually have bipartisan legislation that would solve this problem. We have the Restore Trust in Congress Act, which is the product of months of negotiations among a bipartisan group of lawmakers, and for the first time, members who previously championed competing proposals have united behind a single comprehensive bill. The bill would prohibit members of Congress, their spouses, dependent children, and trustees from owning, purchasing, or selling individual stocks, securities, commodities, and similar financial assets. And it includes strong enforcement provisions and meaningful penalties for violation, which means we're not talking about some pie-in-the-sky progressive wish list or partisan grandstanding. We're talking about achievable reform that has actually cleared institutional hurdles and attracted genuine bipartisan support, and is being blocked not because it lacks merit or public backing, but solely because it threatens the financial interests of the people who control whether it gets a vote. The political theory here is absolutely crucial to understand, because what we're witnessing is a perfect demonstration of how elite capture functions in supposedly democratic systems, and this goes back to foundational questions about representation and accountability that political philosophers have grappled with for centuries, from Madison's warnings about faction in Federalist 10 to contemporary scholarship on regulatory capture and rent-seeking behavior. And the core insight is that when the people who make the rules have material interests that conflict with the public good, you get exactly the kind of self-dealing corruption that we're seeing with congressional stock trading, because only 2 in 10 Americans trust the government to do what is right for them, and they are constantly seeing their elected officials selling them out to the highest bidder, seeing the people elected to represent them instead, making decisions to increase their own personal wealth, and this trust deficit becomes a crisis of democratic legitimacy when citizens conclude rationally that their representatives are not actually working on their behalf, but are instead using public office as a vehicle for private enrichment. Now I want you to understand something really important about why this matters beyond just the specific issue of stock trading, because this corruption intersects with virtually every major policy question facing this country, and fundamentally shapes whose interests get represented in legislative outcomes. So when you have members of Congress who hold significant positions in cryptocurrency, and 10 members of Congress currently hold between $750,000 in crypto assets, how are we supposed to trust that regulatory decisions about cryptocurrency are being made based on what's best for consumers and financial stability, rather than what will maximize the value of congressional portfolios? When you have members trading in defense contractors and pharmaceutical companies and tech giants, how can we have any confidence that decisions about military spending or drug pricing or antitrust enforcement are reflecting the public interest rather than portfolio management? The answer is that we can't. We have no basis for that confidence because the structural incentives are completely misaligned, and this misalignment corrupts everything downstream from it, because every policy debate becomes haunted by the question of whether positions are motivated by principle or profit. And this is where we need to connect what Senator Ossoff revealed to the broader pattern of democratic backsliding and institutional decay that defines our contemporary political moment, because the obstruction of popular reform through procedural manipulation by entrenched interests represents a form of democratic dysfunction that feeds directly into the rise of anti-establishment politics and the erosion of faith in constitutional governance. And I don't mean this in some abstract theoretical way. I mean that when ordinary citizens watch legislation with 86% support get killed behind closed doors by leaders protecting their trading privileges, it creates a rational basis for concluding that the system cannot be reformed from within, and that voting itself is insufficient to produce change. And this is precisely the kind of legitimacy crisis that authoritarian movements exploit by positioning themselves as the only force willing to take on corrupt elites, even as they typically represent an even more rapacious form of elite predation. And the tragedy is that we have the tools to address this corruption right now through legislation that's already been drafted and negotiated and passed committee, but those tools are being deliberately withheld by the very people who are supposed to be our representatives. Let me tell you what's going to happen next, because momentum is building and the pressure is becoming impossible to ignore, and we're seeing something potentially transformative emerging from this fight. So, House Speaker Mike Johnson, who doesn't trade stocks, supports a ban, but hasn't committed to a vote yet, though Pennsylvania Republican Brian Fitzpatrick says he's confident this time there is momentum, and President Trump said in a Time magazine interview this year that he would sign a ban on congressional stock trading if it came to his desk, though Trump accused Nancy Pelosi of becoming rich by having inside information and called for an investigation, claiming without providing evidence that she has the highest return of anybody practically in the history of Wall Street, which shows how this issue cuts across typical partisan lines, creates strange bedfellow coalitions, because even Trump, whose administration has been credibly accused of all manner of corruption, understands that this is a politically potent issue with his base, since it taps into populist resentment of political elites enriching themselves while claiming to serve the people. But here's what we cannot allow to happen, and this is absolutely critical because there's always a danger with these moments of supposed bipartisan consensus, that they get transformed into symbolic victories that don't actually address the underlying problem, or that they get watered down through amendment and compromise until they're functionally meaningless. And the critical difference between some bills is that certain versions also ban the president and vice president from making trades while in office, though that provision wouldn't go into effect until after President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance leave office, which tells you everything about how even reform efforts can be shaped to protect the powerful. And some Republican senators dismissed the bill as a messaging bill, arguing that insider trading is already illegal and expressing particular concern over provisions requiring divestiture of private assets, panning the proposal as an attempt to block former President Donald Trump from being president again, which demonstrates the bad faith arguments that will be deployed to kill reform even by people who claim to support anti-corruption measures in principle. So what do we do with this information, and how do we transform moral outrage into political power that can overcome the institutional resistance that Senator Ossoff is describing? First, we need to understand that this is fundamentally a question of political will rather than policy design, because we have the legislation already written, and we have overwhelming public support, and we have committee passage, and what we don't have is leadership willing to bring it to a vote, and that means the strategy has to focus on making the political cost of obstruction higher than the personal financial cost of passing the ban, and that requires sustained public pressure and primary challenges against members who block reform and media coverage that names names and forces votes, and makes it impossible for leadership to kill this quietly behind closed doors. Lawmakers stated that banning congressional stock trading has been a priority, and because of the support of the American people on this issue, they have generated the momentum necessary to introduce the bipartisan Restore Trust in Congress Act, and they look forward to bringing this to the floor and banning the trading of individual stock by members of Congress, which means that members are feeling the pressure and understand that this issue has political salience, and our job is to make that pressure absolutely unbearable until they have no choice but to act. This is also where progressive analysis of structural power becomes essential, because we need to understand that congressional stock trading isn't some isolated corruption scandal separate from other forms of elite capture and corporate influence over politics. It's part of the same ecosystem, produces massive campaign contributions, and revolving door lobbying and regulatory agencies, staffed by industry insiders, and all the other mechanisms through which concentrated wealth translates into political power and undermines democratic accountability, and you cannot fix congressional stock trading in isolation without also addressing campaign finance and lobbying, and the fundamental question of whether we have a government of by and for the people, or a plutocracy that uses democratic rhetoric to legitimize oligarchic rule, and this is why figures like Reps. Brian Fitzpatrick and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, working together on this issue is so significant because it suggests the possibility of a cross-ideological coalition united around democratic reform, even if they disagree about economic policy more broadly. We also need to reckon with the historical parallels here, because Tammany Hall's political machine dominated New York City using political patronage and honest graft to control power while lining their pockets, and while corruption fueled its influence, mounting public outrage, investigative journalists and reform movements ultimately led to its downfall, and today a different form of honest graft is thriving in Washington as politicians continue exploiting privileged insider information to trade stocks, and this comparison to Tammany Hall isn't just colorful rhetoric, it's a reminder that machine politics and corruption have been defeated before through sustained organizing and political mobilization, and that institutional decay is not inevitable if citizens are willing to fight for accountability and this should give us hope even as we confront the enormity of the corruption we're facing, because history shows that entrenched corrupt systems can be dismantled when public pressure becomes overwhelming, and when reformers inside and outside institutions work together to create change. The stakes here really could not be higher, and I need you to understand this viscerally, because we're not just talking about whether some senators get to make extra money on stock trades, we're talking about whether American democracy can maintain even minimal legitimacy as a system of popular self-governance, or whether it completes its transformation into a formalized oligarchy where the wealthy and powerful make policy to enrich themselves, while ordinary citizens are left with the hollow ritual of voting for representatives who openly defy their wishes and serve other masters, and when 86% of people across party lines support prohibiting members of Congress from trading stocks. But legislation to implement that ban gets killed behind closed doors. We have crossed a threshold where the gap between democratic theory and oligarchic practice becomes so wide that the entire legitimacy of the system comes into question, and that legitimacy crisis has profound consequences for social stability and political violence, and the possibility of authoritarian backlash, because people do not indefinitely tolerate being ruled by a corrupt elite that mocks their demands for accountability. This is also fundamentally about the moral character of leadership, and what kind of people we empower to make decisions that affect millions of lives and shape the future of our society, and the culture of entitlement and self-dealing that congressional stock trading represents reveals something deeply disturbing about how political elites view their role, because information lawmakers have access to as members of Congress should only be used to serve constituents, not ourselves, and this should be the most basic principle of representative government, that you use the power entrusted to you by voters to advance their interests rather than to enrich yourself. But when that principle gets violated systematically, and when the violators face no consequences, and when institutions protect wrongdoers rather than holding them accountable, you get the complete inversion of democratic values and the normalization of corruption as just the way things work. And this normalization is perhaps the most insidious part, because it creates a culture where graft and self-dealing are expected, and anyone who objects or tries to reform the system gets dismissed as naive or unrealistic. So let me bring this full circle back to what Senator Ossoff revealed in that clip, because what he did was puncture the veil of procedural legitimacy that allows leadership to kill popular legislation without accountability. He forced into public view the private conversations where senators lobby leadership to prevent votes on bills they know would pass, but that would threaten their financial interests. And by naming this dynamic explicitly, he makes it much harder for leadership to continue the obstruction quietly, because now we know what's happening, and we know who's responsible, and we can organize political pressure, specifically targeting the mechanisms of obstruction, rather than just expressing general frustration with congressional dysfunction. And this is what good faith reformers inside institutions can do when they're willing to break ranks and tell the truth about how power powerates and why popular reforms get blocked. And this is why having people like Ossoff and Kelly, who have put their own stock portfolios in blind trusts and are among only a handful of senators who have done so, matters, because they have moral authority on this issue that comes from having made personal sacrifices to align their behavior with their principles. The intellectual framework we need here draws on everything from political economy to ethical philosophy to organizational theory, because we're trying to understand how institutions that claim democratic legitimacy can systematically frustrate democratic will, and the answer involves principal-agent problems, where representatives are supposed to be agents of the public, but instead become principals pursuing their own interests, and regulatory capture, where the people being regulated control the regulators, and collective action problems, where individual members might prefer reform but can't coordinate to overcome leadership resistance. And understanding these dynamics is essential because it helps us identify leverage points where intervention can be effective, rather than just engaging in unfocused outrage that doesn't translate into strategic action. And this is where the marriage of moral clarity and tactical sophistication becomes essential, because we need both the righteous anger that comes from witnesses, injustice, and the clear-eyed analysis that figures out how to actually win, rather than just bear witness to corruption. And I want to emphasize that this is winnable. This is actually an issue where we can achieve concrete reform if we maintain pressure and refuse to let this fade from public attention, because the political dynamics are unusually favorable, with bipartisan public support and bipartisan legislative sponsorship, and even nominal support from Trump, who could be pressured to deliver on his stated position. And the main obstacle is simply leadership, refusing to allow votes, and that kind of obstruction becomes harder to maintain when it's exposed, and when members face constituent pressure, and when the political cost of blocking reform exceeds the personal financial cost of passing it. And that's the calculation we need to change through organizing and activism, and primary challenges and media pressure, and every other tool of democratic politics, because this is exactly the kind of fight that movements win when they refuse to accept procedural defeat and keep pushing until leadership has no choice but to relent. Let me end with this, because it's important to connect this specific fight over congressional stock trading to the broader project of democratic renewal and resistance to oligarchy that must define progressive politics in this moment of crisis. We are living through a period of profound institutional failure, where wealth inequality has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age, and where concentrated economic power has translated into concentrated political power in ways that make mockery of democratic forms, and where ordinary people correctly perceive that the system is rigged against them and serves the interests of a narrow elite. And in this context, every fight for transparency and accountability and democratic reform takes on heightened significance, because we're not just addressing discrete policy problems, we're fighting for the very possibility of self-governance and trying to prevent the complete collapse of democratic legitimacy that would open the door to authoritarian solutions. And this means that when Senator Ossoff stands up and exposes how popular legislation to ban congressional stock trading is being killed behind closed doors to protect financial interests of senators, he's not just talking about one bill or one form of corruption, he's illuminating the fundamental crisis of our democracy and showing us exactly where we need to fight and what we need to fight for. And that's why this clip should matter to everyone who cares about justice and equality and the possibility of building a political system that actually serves the common good, rather than enriching those who already have power and wealth. Because if we can't even prevent members of Congress from using their positions to engage in legalized insider trading, despite overwhelming public support for a ban, then what hope do we have of addressing any of the deeper structural problems facing our democracy and our society? But I believe we can win this fight. I believe the momentum is real, and the public pressure is building, and the contradictions are becoming unsustainable. And if we maintain focus and continue organizing and refuse to accept procedural obstruction as the final word, then we can force this legislation to the floor and pass it into law and establish a crucial principle that public office cannot be used for private enrichment, and that principle, once established, becomes a foundation for broader reforms that can begin to reclaim democratic governance from oligarchic capture. And that's what makes this moment so important, and why you need to pay attention and get involved and make your voice heard, because this is a fight we can actually win if we're willing to fight it.